warm introduction. All this, of course, is part of the post-Ottoman world. And so we come to the question of food, and we ask, what is Ottoman food? And it could be argued that the very idea of Ottoman food is post-Ottoman. That at the time of the Ottomans themselves, these questions did not arise in public discourse, other than perhaps specialist historians. But it arises in the modern context of a globalized world in which food styles are related to national and ethnic identities on a world stage on which food has become a spectacle and a recreation, with marketing, travel, and media. Ottoman, as distinct from plain Turkish or Middle Eastern, acquires an imperial connotation of luxury and sophistication. So in fact, then you have cookbooks and you have restaurants that boast that they have Ottoman food. For the actual diversity of populations and classes of Ottoman society, such questions did not arise. People took their food for granted and may have considered it superior to that of their neighboring communities. And for the great majority of the working and especially the rural population, there wasn't much choice. The main issue of public discourse among the upper and more learned layers of the population would have been that of diet, health, and medicine, rather than the question of identity and taste. Ottoman culture was a synthesis of preceding empires and regions, from the Byzantine to the Persian Arabic to the actual Turks of the steppes. All these were woven together and also diversified by the many diverse regions of the empire. So one way of looking at what we might mean by Ottoman food, and one that would, from which one can argue about subsequent developments into the modern world, is to talk about the Ottoman court and the Ottoman courtly cuisine, and compare it with that of Europe, especially of France, and see what the consequences are. We have a very good historical study of Ottoman court cuisine in the 15th to the 17th century, based on archives and recipes. It was Stefan Gerasimos, who was the director of the French Research Institute in Istanbul for many years and died a few years ago. And he wrote this book called À la table du Grand Turc. Ottoman bureaucracy was meticulous in recording the quantities of purchases, both for the palace and for the soup kitchens of the capital, which fed students, teachers, mosque functionaries, and designated categories of the poor. Some menus of palace fare at different points in time were also preserved. Gerasimos also resorted to accounts of meals and events by European ambassadors and functionaries. He traced the elements of Ottoman food at these different levels in the classical age of the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and of Suleiman the Magnificent in the following century. It's one thing to record ingredients and menus, another to know how they are cooked. Gerasimos resorts to the manuscripts of 15th century book of recipes by Mehmed Shirvani, who was in fact mostly an unacknowledged transcription of the 13th century manuscript of al-Baghdadi Kitab al-Tabikh. Only Shirvani seems to have added 82 recipes of his own, which Gerasimos surmised were those of the 15th century. Indeed, many tallied with the named dishes of menu records. it would seem that the palace menus, including the fare eaten by the Sultan, were, while opulent, relatively simple and repetitive. 2 meals a day were eaten, each consisting of 2 or 3 dishes, typically boiled rice with egg, mantu, a kind of dumpling, or ravioli, in soup or in yogurt, which is common in Central Asia and Turkey to the present day, and probably of Chinese descent. Then we have vermicelli with milk. Another day, manti again, muhallabi, a blancmange of rice flour with milk and strips of chicken breast. Different forms of kalia featured frequently, a ragu of lamb and vegetables or fruit. Fruit and vegetables were used interchangeably, as they were also in Europe at that time. Following the season, the meats were uniformly mutton, lamb, and chicken, roasted and stewed. Sugar, honey, vinegar, saffron, cumin, and pepper were regular additions to the soups and stews. Fish was rare, and this is really interesting, odd in Istanbul. And when fish occurred on the menu, it was typically freshwater fish, which was trout brought from Bursa, as against the fish that was swimming all around the palace in the waters around Istanbul. And when it occurred, from Bursa, the exception to this avoidance of fish was the menu of Mehmed II Fatih, who was the conqueror of Constantinople, who ruled between 1451 and 1481, who appears to have enjoyed caviar, oysters, and prawns, all items that were subsequently entirely absent. The medium of cookery was animal fat, copious amounts of butter, shipped from as far as the Crimea across the Black Sea and from Moldavia. The height of richness and opulence described in poetry was rice dripping with butter. Butter and sugar and wheat were the base ingredients for the most luxurious foods, pastries and sweets, which were prepared and consumed in great volume and diversity, with extensive kitchens, helvahane, devoted to their production. Drink, in the form of flavored and sugared waters, with musk and ambergris, sorbets and syrups, and compotes of dried fruit were served after the meal. There's no mention of wine in these accounts, which we know from other sources that wine was commonly taken at court, and many of the sultans were known for their fondness for the stuff. It is likely that the wine table was distinct from the dinner table, and we find some accounts, including stories from the 1001 Nights about this. The dinner table is removed and then the wine table is brought on. We should also note some relevance of this account to the idea of the Mediterranean diet, the idea of olive oil, fish, fruit, and vegetables, and little meat and animal fats. Ottoman diet, not only for the Sultan but throughout, seems to have been very different from that. It wasn't the kind of European antiquity, 3 elements of the vine, the olives, and wheat. For the Ottomans, it was sugar, butter, and rice. And olive oil was used primarily for lighting and for soap, and only really came into use much more later in the 18th, 19th century, and even then it was very restricted. The favorite medium of cooking, especially of cooking meat, was butter, and if not butter, then the rendered fat of the sheep's tail. This is in stark contrast to the French court and aristocracy, especially from the reign of Louis XIV. Ottoman courtiers ate well, but stuck to particular favorites, homely and repetitive. This contrast may be partly accounted for by the respective sociologies of the court. Mehmed II Fateh, that is the 15th century, introduced the regime by which the Sultan ate alone, which continued until the mid-19th century. It's often served by pages and eunuchs, and sometimes members of the harem. The French kings also dined alone, with intimates, but in public, with the menu being a display, a spectacle of magnificence and luxury. So I don't know whether you saw in films and also including the recent series on Versailles, in which the dining hall would be thronged with tables, the king and his special favorites, the high table, the high nobility on lower tables, and the great majority of the courtiers just standing around watching. Then when they all finished, then those who were standing around watching would then descend on the leftovers. Now, so he ate alone, but as a spectacle being observed. Cooks and managers had every incentive to innovate and shine. They also faced the rivalry of other grand tables of the high nobility. Cuisine became a subject of public interest and rivalry. Not so with the private and secluded dining of the Ottoman court, which remained repetitive and domestic. I should say, of course, there were also displays in the Ottoman court on state occasions and on occasions, royal occasions, of weddings and of circumcisions of the sons and so on, in which you'd have great banquets with great display of different kinds of pilavs and birds in feather, this usual kind of stuff, peacocks and, many carcasses of sheep and everything else. But that was again, this would be on the special occasions. Now, so not so with the cuisine became in France and then subsequently in Europe a subject of public interest and rivalry. Not so much with the private and secluded dining of Ottoman court, which remained repetitive and domestic. This was an important difference of the Ottoman court from other European counterparts. It did not feature an independent nobility, peers who participated in ceremonies, balls, festivities, and dinners. The Ottoman court contained dignitaries in the form of viziers, high clerics, and military chiefs. But the ceremonies which they participated were highly formalized and stratified. There was a definite hierarchy of who ate with whom. The Sultan alone, the Grand Vizier ate with the Bash Defterdar, the kind of finance minister. The two Qadi Askar, chief judges, ate together. The leftover dishes of the Vizier were then served to the chief of the guards, and so on. Women in their private, entirely segregated, women in their private quarters were served according to rank. Wine was consumed, often copiously, but not with these formalized meals, but not publicly, and as such, not part of public conviviality. Now, I'll skip the banquets. I've already mentioned the banquets and the participation of the dignitaries. How am I okay for time?
No problem.
So, whereas with the French and then the European, the display of food and the idea of cuisine and the idea of methods and so on becoming one of public discourse, which is the courts and then percolating down to the bourgeoisie, what you had was an emphasis on innovation. So without going into details, you can see that there was succession in France and then you following in Europe of the idea of nouvelle cuisine, of the new type of food. So each generation you had the kind of high priests of gastronomy who were saying, well, our ancestors, their food was too crude, too heavy, and we've got now much more refined food, and this is nouvelle cuisine, and the nouvelle cuisine goes on to into modern times. And now, of course, this emphasis on innovation now tails into the whole culture of food as spectacle, food as recreation, of marketing, of restaurants, of media, of the endless television shows and what have you. And then you have this kind of paradox. On the one hand, the emphasis on authenticity, this is authentic food, and then the one of innovation. You see it very well in the television series called the Great British Menu, in which every cook is proclaiming that what he or she is doing is authentic British and based on bread and butter pudding or whatever, but then deconstructed and reconstructed in such a way that the whole point of it is completely new. So you have this kind of dynamic that develops from there. With the Ottoman world, the dynamic doesn't really come from above. It comes really from the increasing movement of population, diversity of populations, the cities being transformed in the 17th and 18th centuries with wars and rebellions and movements of all kinds, which then re-inhabit the cities. And so much then comes from the various kinds of stuffed vegetables, preserved fish, especially all kinds of fish, and meats of preserved meats of various kinds. The whole repertoire of what then became known as Ottoman, the food of the Ottoman lands, was then developed really not so much from the top, although there was some input from there, but from the diversification of the bottom. It is from this diversification and regionalism that I want to point, if I have time, to another element of the post-Ottoman world, and that is a particular region which has been particularly important and productive, and that is the region of southern Anatolia, the Arab Levant, Syria and Lebanon, into western Iran and into northern Iraq and Cyprus. And this constituted a kind of food region. And so many of the foods that are known now as Middle Eastern foods, as Eastern Mediterranean and so on, originate in this area. The various, the salads, the stews, the kibbeh genre, the stuffed dumplings of burghul and meat, and the variations on these, infinite variations, and all kinds, the famous hummus, all this, and the center of this area were the cities, particularly Aleppo. Aleppo was, of course, an Ottoman city, and it was distinguished by its food, and it had its satellites, including Antab, which is now Gaziantep, Urfa, Mosul in Iraq, all were satellites of Halab. And what is very interesting about this region is that it had a diversity of ethnicities. So there were Turks, there were Kurds, there were Armenians, there were Arabs, there were Jews, and they all shared this common food repertoire. And so what happens in the post-Ottoman world, and especially with the horrible things that happened up to World War I and the massacres and the dispersion of populations and what have you, is that these populations have ended up in so many different parts of the world, in the West and in other parts of the Middle East and what have you. So this common geographical heritage, as it were, is being claimed by each ethnic which branch from there. So you have Armenia. I heard an Armenian academic talk about Armenian food rituals, and she lives in America, and she's talking about the on holy days, on Good Friday or something like that, in which you have this particular dish called harissa, which is wheat and meat, which is pounded together, and people stay up all night pounding and chanting religious dirges, and it just struck me immediately that exactly the same thing is done by Muslims, Shiite Muslims in Muharram, Sunni Muslims in other places, Jews, and so on, and it's called harissa. And so, where it's being presented as Armenian, which is Armenian, no question, but it's also all these others. And so, in fact, then you have, with the rise of nationalism, then you have each one of these, what was a geographical region, then becomes being claimed by nationalities and ethnicities. And an interesting part of that is the hummus wars. Don't know about, I'm sure you know about the hummus wars, a few years ago, in which, the Israelis declared hummus to be an Israeli dish, and the Lebanese were very upset about this, and they tried to classify hummus as appellation contrôlée for the Lebanese, and they failed to do that. And of course, it's apparently now in 40% of fridges in domestic homes in England, in Britain, have hummus in them, and yet it's it's still the subject of these claims. And of course, in Israel, Israel of course had no. It's a country of immigrants as well, and so some of the immigrants, many of the immigrants, in fact, come from the Middle East regions and from Arab countries and so on. And so that's also part of their food is these areas. So we have these post-Ottoman foodscapes, which are being constructed and codified, not so much in the countries themselves, but on the global stage. Because who identifies, what is Armenian, what is Lebanese, what is Arab, what is Turkish. All this is being done on an international stage with diasporas and with trade and with marketing. And so, the post-Ottoman is now reverting to trying to construct the Ottoman and to construct all the identities that developed from it. Right. Finished.
Well, that brings us clearly to empire and the complexity of a word like empire. We have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Yes?
Thank you. That was fascinating.
I'm sorry, let me put in my...
This was fascinating. Thank you so much. I think I have 2 kind of separate questions. The first question is more about how you go about finding what normal, ordinary people ate in 16th century, 17th century. When you talk, first part of your talk was based on Coptic cuisine because there was documents there. But as you said, most of them probably ordinary people ate whatever they can get hold of. They could get hold of rather than anything else. But also you you mentioned the diversification of population because of the population movement within the Ottoman Empire, which brought about kind of dynamism toward the so-called Ottoman cuisine. So just kind of my first question is about so how do you go about finding out? How can we,
well, first of all, sorry, did you finish?
Yeah, and the second one,
Yeah.
it's about this idea of Ottoman cuisine. You're talking it with the influence of globalization. Globalization makes food national, ethnic, etc., which probably even imperial, which didn't exist before. But wasn't the environment to be a melting pot of all these and kind of melting pot of different groups, different peoples, which were supposed to produce some sort of integrated, but kind of mosaic of different things in such particular loose framework. So I just wonder if you could say a bit more about supposedly integrating effects of empire on culture in general.
I'm not sure I understood that answer. Yeah, well, I can answer the first question. Well, the first question, there are records of markets. So you know what ingredients were being served. You know, markets were taxed. So you know they have a list of things. The other thing in Ottoman cities were the soup kitchens. So you have what's called imaret, which so the big mosques and religious foundations had attached to them soup kitchens, which catered for the clerics, for the students, and also for the poor, particular registered poor. And we have records of the ingredients and menus from these soup kitchens, imaret. We also have travelers' accounts, including one famous traveler called Evliya Çelebi in the 17th century, who wrote copiously a work called Siyahatname, the Book of Travel. And he describes food and markets in different places, but he's given to exaggeration. So you have great numbers of everything and so on. Yeah. The second question, I'm not sure I understood.
I just wonder if, because your point seems to be that Ottoman cuisine was created post-Ottoman because of globalization. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the effect of empire or imperial structure on producing or not producing certain common culture.
Yeah, well, they certainly, as I tried to indicate, that there were kind of a moving synthesis of cultures, which, from one. And of course, the synthesis doesn't mean that there is no innovation or new things happening, because obviously there is. So you have, various kinds of sweets and sweetmeats, while they may have originated in Byzantium or in Persia, by the time you get to the 15th or 16th century in Ottoman cities, they've become something else. The idea, which is true, and of course the great transformation came with the American imports. Can you imagine any of these cuisines without a tomato? But the tomato only really became established in the Ottoman world, in the main cities, in the middle of the 19th century, the 1860s, and in backwaters like Baghdad, not until the early 20th century. I've heard elderly people, Iraqi, recalling, their childhood when tomato first came in, and what people thought about the tomato.
What did they think about?
Huh?
What did they think about?
Well, they thought it was dangerous, like everywhere, And they called it red aubergine. the American imports.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your use of the term foodscapes. You have it in the title, and then at the end you kind of flesh it out somewhat in relation to these cuisines that essentially migrated out of the Ottoman Empire and are taken to be, the Armenian traditional food or some other traditional food. But I wonder if you just could say a little bit more about the concept of foodscape as you.
The concept of
foodscape.
Foodscape. Well, I wasn't really thinking of it as a concept. I was thinking of it as a kind of designation. The idea of the fields of repertoires of food.
But still, if you take your point about this foodscape over such a large area and region, coming over so-called ethnic differences, which are then diverse, then taken away with them and turned into ethnic nationalism. That original idea of something that unifies this whole region, but which does not form a kind of ethnic political part of identity, but is what they all share, has a kind of rather Frederick Barth kind of connotation to it. You need to have, in order to have the difference, you've got to have that larger unity. In other words, you get that idea of boundaries being created out of something which they all share.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of it more in reference to like Apartheid and the global ecumen and the idea that you have, say, mediascapes and the political scape and the technoscape that you have in the context of globalization, that he tried to define it in terms of that you have these different types of, I was going to say forces, he calls them, scapes, that basically you have something like a television show which is in one place and it may be something totally different in another place, but then it becomes all these different kind of factors interspersed, that they may have originated in some place, but they're no longer really of that place per se. So that's what it evoked to me, but maybe it didn't. Maybe it didn't evoke any of that to you. But at the end, when you start talking about the, when you're talking about the Armenian food actually being the food, or the same food being Armenian in one place and being something else some other place, actually having originated, it sounded like that. It sounded like it was evoking that concept, but maybe it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Armenians, by the way, have always been renowned to the present day of being great cooks and caterers. So, in a city like Beirut now, the kind of Armenian quarter is people go there especially to have, eat foods that are familiar, but which are especially well done in the Armenian quarter. We made a film about it, which makes you very hungry.
I just had a question about what you left out, Sami, the banquets.
Yeah. Oh, of course, that's your subject.
Yes.
Well, they had these grand banquets in which, the emphasis is on display and quantity. And the Sultan himself would never preside over that because he was secluded. But then the high dignitaries would be there, and of course the table would be segregated by rank, and who's as presidents. And then at the end of it, you would invite in the soldiers, the janissaries, and there would be occasions in which they have a kind of ritual pillage. So it's just like being, pillaging the food. They would descend on it, fight each other, and that would be a spectacle for the others. At the same time, on this grand occasion, you had sculptors who made figures out of spun sugar. Spun sugar, of course, was a very valuable commodity, sweetness generally. And so in the park outside the Topkapi Palace, they erect these animals and buildings and so on, made out of spun sugar. And then when the time comes, after the festivities are ending, the populace generally would have permission to attack these. So they attack them, break them up, and eat the sugar, and that would be also a spectacle. And these banquets seem to have been highly stereotyped, what you had, because this Evliya Çelebi, the traveler, would also relate to the same kind of banquets from Iran, from different parts of the Arab. So this was sort of generalized the way in which you hold the banquet.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking, listening to your very interesting discussion. Essentially, Ottoman food was invented. So I have to tell my wife not to go to that place and learn how to cook Ottoman food. But what I wanted to say is we're so fortunate in China, post-Mongol period, because we have the imperial dietary, the Liuchanzhongyao, and then we have popular food encyclopedias and things like that with recipes, which are aimed at the general public. They're not for the court, and they tell us what they're cooking. And we have popular literature. We have the plays. Like in the plays, the hero is often going to give his girlfriend, is going to get her drunk, and he says, I have Sayin Darasun, good wine. He says it in Mongolian. And so we know that probably hard liquor, one distillation, was popular among the masses. And then by the time you get down to the 16th century, you have books like the Jinping Mei, the Golden Lotus, that's all they do is have sex and eat, and things like that. But I always thought of Ottoman Empire as being a kind of a fascinating place because the source material is so rich.
Because, yeah. Sorry,
I'm just thinking about that.
Yes. There were books of recipes, but they weren't all that common and not so widespread. And the most the items that were most celebrated repeatedly were sweets and pastries and various kinds of confectionery. There's a great deal written on that and mentioned on markets and so on.
On that sweet note, we may move on to our second speaker, Cuisine, and thank you very much, Sami, You have your.
Come over here.
You're all set up? Okay.
Yeah, as long as it works.
Got some water, right?